Tehran announced that it has started uranium enrichment at 60% and precedented that we have not seen in any previous cycles of escalation. Diplomats and experts affirm that this percentage indicates that Iran's pursuit to become a nuclear threshold state puts the international community before a new reality. This escalation could be part of Tehran efforts to gain more concessions from the West during talks of returning to the nuclear deal. However, some information indicates that this issue goes beyond the negotiation game with the West and can be interpreted as part of Iran's growing ambitions to become a nuclear threshold state. While this step reflects the desire of some sovereign entities outside the Iranian government, the latter supports this move to a great extent. All of this has revived speculation on Iran's nuclear breakout time and has negatively affected the credibility of monitoring and verification system set up by the JCPOA. Several indications have come out of Iran in recent months on the need to move towards acquiring the atomic bomb. Iranian President Rouhani affirmed that it is a matter of hours if Iran chooses to enrich uranium to 19%, which traditionally means reaching the nuclear threshold. So what separates Iran from nuclear thresholds is a political decision. Iranian Minister of Intelligence has once said that Tehran could move in this direction if pressure continues on this country. This raises the following question. Are we going to see the 2015 Iran's model where a dialogue was held when the international community was terrified of the possibility of Iran acquiring the nuclear bomb? Are we going to see the Iraqi model when the country's nuclear facilities were targeted and its nuclear program was crippled? Israel then insisted on implementing that choice. Are we going to see the Pakistani and the North Korean models when dialogue was held while the nuclear bomb was in the position? Or are we going to see a new model of a nuclear state, a state that espouses an aggressive expansionist regional agenda and use its nuclear power as the threat, to its agenda for regional hegemony? What are the choices of regional and global powers on each of these potential scenarios? To answer this question and more, we start the first panel titled Between the Nuclear Threshold and the Nuclear Bomb, and welcome our distinguished guest speakers, Ambassador Dor Gold, President of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, and he was holding a lot, but for the case of time, I'm so sorry, I will not go through detailed CVs. And of course, we are pleasure to have Kristen Fontrose, Director of the Screwcraft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. And last but not least, General Yusuf Cooper-Wasser, Senior Project Manager on Regional Affairs at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. By tracking Iranian political discourse, we can differentiate between the desire to acquire the nuclear bomb and the desire to reach the nuclear threshold. All positions coming out of center of power Iran shows that there is some to be a broad consensus among the regime ranks that the country must become a nuclear threshold state. These parties, however, differ on issues of acquiring the nuclear bomb. Acquiring the nuclear bomb is supposed to subject to the Iranian regime to subject the Iranian regime to more sanctions, thus increasing its financial troubles and public resentment and protest. It's also post-nuclear expansion strategy outside the agenda of the Iranian public troubles. We have seen such public mobilization against nuclear program during Iran's 2013 presidential election. This raises that question, which I will share with my guests. I will start with Kristen and Ambassador Gold, and this is for both of you. Can the political regime in Iran mobilize Iranian public behind the nuclear bomb will, or does it have alternatives, one of which can be separating between the regime and a populist legitimacy? Here we can point to Iranian Minister Zarif reference in his recently leaked interview about the popular interaction with heroes. And what the deep state going to deal with the public resentment caused by economic pressure due to a sanction imposed as a result of the continued implementation of the nuclear expansion strategy. I will start with Kristen, if you allow me, Ambassador. Ladies first.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eftesan, and thank you, Ambassador, for allowing me a moment to comment. For it is our understanding that the Iranian population sees their Iranian nuclear program as a nationalist self-right. They believe that if other nations have these types of programs, that they are also entitled to, and they do separate that from their discontent with the regime. So they feel separately that they both have the right to a nuclear program and that the regime is not meeting their local needs. We do understand that there are still some uprisings happening quietly inside Iran and that we will likely see additional protests. There was a lot of debate about whether or not that protests would arise after the election. We're hearing more and more that some of these protests are broiling up. They won't necessarily come from the same sectors we've seen as what we're hearing from folks inside, from friends inside, but that the regime certainly has not bought public contentment with this new election. By far, the opposite is true. But I think we should expect the population to continue to separate these two things, the regime discontent and the nuclear program, and to understand that the population does believe that having a nuclear program is their right. The question is, do they understand the trade-off between the costs of their nuclear program and what that could be providing them in social services, jobs, programs, and the like? The expenditures, if you pay for one, you can't pay for the other. And if the population is not entirely aware of this, that may be one of the reasons they continue to support a nuclear program in lieu of the kinds of things they've been asking for.
Great. Ambassador Good?
Look,
What's your take on this?
Sure. The critical question is how the Iranians understand the Western reaction. If they think the West is intimidated by Iran, if they think that the West is in retreat from Iran, then the Iranian government will feel that it has huge freedom of maneuver to have its cake and eat it too. Meaning it can have its nuclear program, it can somehow restore its economy to a minimal level so that the population will be satisfied. I think there's another element here that is hard to measure in GNP terms. And that other element is, we always talk about the malign activities of the Iranians, Hezbollah, Houthis, and such organizations, the Shia militia groups across the Middle East. I think all of those are a reflection of Iran's quest for regional hegemony. And when you look at some of the statements that come out of the Iranian parliament over the years, and you see references to various Middle Eastern countries as being once part of Iran, this is part of a a self-image in Iran of wanting to recover lost territories. And if that is the case, then the question is, does moving forward with a nuclear program, does crossing some thresholds in the nuclear program assist them in that very deep nationalistic objective, or does it make it more difficult? I believe they think it assists them. And the statements they have made are not just with respect to the famous case of Bahrain, they're with respect to virtually all the countries that were once part of the Safavid Empire. So I believe that Iran is on a roll, as they say, to try and put as many of these countries as possible under its yoke. And it will require a combination of our cooperation, and it will require determination coming out of the West, showing that the West does not plan to tolerate this Iranian quest for hegemony.
Okay, thank you. General Cooper, decision makers in Tehran affirm that Iran only needs a political decision to reach the nuclear threshold. At the field level, some developments such as installing advanced version of centrifuges indicate that Iran is moving in this direction. So does Iran really have a technical capability to enrich uranium up to 90%, or this is just a political maneuver to frighten the international community and get more concessions?
Well, I think that first and foremost, it's a political maneuver, but it cannot be a successful political maneuver unless they manage to convince everybody that they also have the technical capability to get there. And the truth is that they are very close to having this technical capability. We don't know enough about their weaponization program, but from what we learned from the archives that Israel brought from Tehran, the impression we can get is that much of the riddles that they had to solve in order to get the capability to produce nuclear weapons, they made some progress on. Maybe they didn't finish everything, but they made some progress on. And they might have done some progress during the years since 2003 until now. They had enough time. And the groups that were designated to work on these issues were still keeping together, the same people. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh is missing now, but many people that worked under him in the project itself kept working with him during all these years. I'm sure that made some progress on these matters as well. So, and the ability to enrich uranium with advanced centrifuges that enrich uranium much faster makes it, this possibility one that we have to take seriously. That said, still, this is a political maneuver because they understand that trying at this point to cross the threshold that separates them from having the enough fissile material to produce a nuclear weapon is extremely dangerous at this point. And
percentage, how much you give them? Is 60 or 90?
No, they have 0% of being able successfully to cross the threshold. That's their assessment in my mind. Because they understand if they will try to do something like that, even the United States, who has a credible military option, Obama prepared it at the time, will be able to use it and prevent them from having the capability to produce the weapon. So they try to get as close as they can in order to deliver this message that, listen, we are serious and we might break into having the capability. But they are very cautious not to convince people that this is really what they're doing. It's very similar to what happened in 2012 when they started accumulating uranium enriched to 20%, and they were getting to something like 230, 200, almost 50 kilograms of this material. And Netanyahu at the time gave this famous speech with the red line and said, listen, you have to realize that if you cross this red line, 250 kilograms of uranium enriched to 20%, something is going to happen. And they never crossed this line. So the same thing is happening now. But it is something that we have to take seriously because at one point, as you mentioned, they have adopt a different political decision and try to break out. If this is going to happen, this is very dangerous. They can have the capability to produce nuclear weapon from the point of view of having enough fissile material for that in a matter of about 2 months. That's all, using the advanced centrifuges. Of course, the ability to sustain such a capability is suffering recently because of all kinds of explosions and things that are happening in Iran, but still they do have the basic capability to do that.
Thank you. Kristen, positions by some figures in sovereign institutions indicate a desire by Iranian regime for nuclear expansion beyond the framework principle by the JCPOA. So, does Iran want to use the nuclear escalation as a tool of pressure to spread up the pace of returning to the nuclear deal, or are we looking at a larger project that intends to go beyond the nuclear threshold to the stage of acquiring the nuclear bomb?
I don't think Iran is actually intent on acquiring a bomb in the near term. I do think this is a pressure tactic. And I think part of the tactic is to take the pressure off of Iran for scaling back some of their other activities. So if you notice in the talks that are happening in Vienna, the sticking point is on sanctions on non-CT related activity and on the Biden administration's insistence that the Iranian regime be willing to engage in future talks about their use of proxies and missiles. And Iran has said, absolutely not. This is a red line for them. And that's causing now talks to break down in Vienna. So while the nuclear program is important for them, in their opinion, as an international standing point, it is our right, it is our place. We are an international power. If we acquire such a weapon, it's great leverage in terms of deterrence that they think they need around the region. But it's really also about ensuring that they are able to protect these pillars of their foreign policy that they think are even more important, which are their proxies and their missiles.
But in your view, Kristen, which is more valuable for them? To be on the threshold, so everybody is running after Iran and negotiate and not to move to a nuclear stage, or declaring themselves as a nuclear power?
It's far more valuable for them to say that they are on the threshold. Once they're a nuclear power, they will take on some international condemnation, and they could very well draw additional attacks from either Israeli forces or elsewhere against their nuclear facilities. They'll also be in a whole different bargaining group, and they'll be under a lot of pressure to engage in non-proliferation talks internationally. As long as they're on the threshold, it's wonderful leverage for getting what they want from Europe, for driving a wedge between Europe and the US, for making Israel look like the bad guy, for trying to reduce their nuclear capabilities in the meantime. It's a sweet spot.
It's a bargaining card. I move to Ambassador, getting close to the nuclear threshold gives Iran the ability to negotiate with the West and the international community to gain more advantage, as Kristen said, at the economic and political levels. Doesn't reaching the stage of making the nuclear bomb, making Iran subject to more international sanctions, thus exacerbating its financial problems?
Well, it depends who the Iranian leadership is worried about and whose interests they want to protect. If they want to protect the interests of the Revolutionary Guard elite who control the economy and who have a special position in the Iranian system, then that's a doable thing. That's possible. I'd also like to point out something else that's going on. You know, if Iran seemed satisfied with its current borders, if it seemed to define its area of military presence as currently designated in the Middle East, that would be one thing. But Iran keeps pushing the limits. You know, we discover, if you take the last 20 years, Iran was the dominant power in the Persian Gulf. And then all of a sudden, wait a minute, they're in the Red Sea. Really? Well, what's next? The Mediterranean. They start moving in the Mediterranean and they seek to have a pier in a Syrian port. So what I'm seeing is that Iran is active in expanding the area of its military presence in the Middle East region. And more countries are affected by this. And these countries are all talking to each other.
Thank you. General Cooper Weiss, can we put the desire by sovereign institutions to go beyond the nuclear threshold and reach the stage of producing the nuclear bomb as a part of the strategic project of these institutions for regional hegemony on ideological premises?
Sure. This is all driven by ideological motivation that the Iranians have, and the idea of the regime is that it is a missionary regime. It's not a regime just to change Iran itself, which they've already done. But it's to change the entire region and furthermore to have an impact globally. That's what drives them, and this is why I think that they don't want to be just a threshold country. Nuclear threshold country. They want to have nuclear weapons. They want to be seen as one of the superpowers, and definitely the Middle East superpower, and later on global superpower. That's what they want. And we have to understand what's happening right now is that they believe that they can move forward in this direction, either along this path that they are now following, which may lead them to one or two weapons, or the capability to produce one or two weapons, or they can embark on a much better path that would lead them maybe within a longer period of time, but without any economic difficulties and without any problems of legitimacy, to having a wide arsenal of nuclear weapons in 10 years or maybe even in 5. That's a JCPOA. And that's why they prefer the JCPOA, and they look at the current track as just a political token with which they can force their way back into the JCPOA under their terms. That's the idea. But what is more, we have to block them on both these tracks. And the way to do it is to deter them from moving forward. That is the way to do that, to charge them with a heavy price for moving in this direction. And the better we can cooperate in doing that, we are going to be more successful. But the problem is that we should be careful to realize that if what they want is to spread their ideology, they can do it in the meanwhile, even without having the nuclear power. The nuclear power is a tool to spreading their ideology. What they're doing right now is spreading their ideology without having a nuclear power. That's why it's so important to deal also with the threat of the Iranian subversion and Iranian support of terrorism and all of that right now, and not wait with that and allow them to have more money and have more capabilities to spread this extreme and dangerous ideology over the territories that are near and far from Iran.
General Nasser, there's somebody, I mean, even the Iranian claim, like, why Israel has the right to have a nuclear bomb, and we are deprived from that. What is the difference?
Well, first of all, Israel doesn't have the right, but but everybody believes that it has it. And the fact is that nobody is worried about thinking that Israel has it. Whereas, because nobody thinks that Israel, if it has a nuclear weapon, is threatening anybody or doing it out of some sort of ideological motivation to make everybody Jewish. The Iranians, everybody understands, they want the weapon in order to spread their influence all over the world, as a matter of fact. That's what they're looking for. And that's why everybody is worried about Iran. On top of that, everybody is also worried that if Iran gets it, everybody would like to have it. And the way it's trying to have it is by breaching the NPT, which means that the international structures that were supposed to prevent dangerous people from having this weapon are not going to function. And that is something that is worrying a lot of people around the world, and especially in the Middle East, and for a very good reason. This is exactly what the Iranians are planning to do.
Thank you. Kirsten, assumed that the conservative government would witness a decline in the discourse calling for bridging the rift with the international community in favor of more ideological one. This would have implications for the nuclear deal more than any other issues because it is the central issue that defines the trajectory of Iran's relation with the international community. In theory, at least a stable government of hardliners would reduce the likelihood of an Iranian-American rapprochement, which was possible in the presence of American Democrat, Iranian moderates. What is your view regarding this, if it happened?
I think this new regime in Iran is looking for a deal between now and inauguration of their presidency. And this is because if they can use tactics like the current refusal to extend the IAEA monitoring agreement and tactics like an uptick in strikes on the US presence in Iraq by Iranian proxies to pressure the Biden team to come to a deal quickly. For instance, the IAEA monitoring agreement expiring, this is causing a little bit of panic in Europe. They are now pressuring the US. You need to come to a deal. You need to finalize. Iran believes, this regime believes that this will force the Biden administration to bend, to concede, and that then they would wind up with a deal that is in their favor. If they can get a deal that is in their favor, then this new administration in Tehran can claim credit for the deal. However, if they do not get a deal that is in their favor because these scare tactics don't work, they still have the ability to blame the Rouhani regime for a bad deal, for bad negotiations, for working with America. So if they can do it between the election and inauguration, they have the ability to swing that messaging however they like based on the outcome. So it's in their interest right now to keep these pressure tactics on.
But Christine, I mean, if they moved towards that also, I don't think the Chinese, the Russian, they will not put pressure on them to come to the negotiations, okay? Because all of them, they want that these sanctions to be left from Iran to trade with this in a normal situation. And the Iranian also have the Chinese alternative, which already they signed that strategic agreement with China. What does it make that? Do you think that Iranian was from the West while they are diverting to the East?
It makes sense for them to divert to the East because the East is willing to work with them on evading sanctions. We know that China does this on oil trade regularly. And while the Chinese and Russians would love for sanctions to be lifted so they can engage in normal trade, really the governments are looking to sell arms. And with the UN arms embargo lifted in October, that's possible. The Chinese and Russians can sell anything they like to Iran right now for the most part. So really their interests are no longer obstructed by sanctions as long as they have ways to continue evading them, to acquire the things that they want to acquire from Iran and to sell what they would like to sell, which looks like it's happening pretty successfully.
Great. I have this question for both Ambassador Gold and General Cooper-Wasson. What are the strategic advantages that Iran can gain, which made Tehran put the acquisition of a nuclear bomb as a priority, even with the growing economic pressure that increased public resentment in the country?
What are the strategic advantages you're saying?
Yeah, that Iran can gain. Yeah.
By
which
getting
made
a
Tehran,
nuclear weapon?
I said, what are the strategic advantages that Iran can gain, which made Tehran put the acquisition of the nuclear bomb as a priority, even with the growing economic pressure that increased public resentment in the country?
I don't believe that Iran sees things the way many of us see them in terms of economic cost benefit. I believe that Iran is an ideologically driven leadership, is made up of an ideologically driven leadership. There's the doctrine of Vilayat al-Faqih, the rulership of the jurisprudent, which basically gives Ayatollah Ali Khamenei dictatorial powers. And that is a function that their program wants to feed and strengthen and put more power into. And I think that is what they're up to. That's what they're doing. It's not an ideology that we're familiar with. It's not an ideology that rings familiar in the House of Commons, in the US Congress, or any place else. It's their ideology. We have to understand it. And that explains what they're really up to.
General Cooper, was it?
First of all, I agree with what Pastor Gould said, but I would add to that they look at it as some interim period through which they're going to suffer. This economy of jihad. Yes, it's just for a short period of time. They believe that in the end, the West is going to cave and accept their terms and will rejoin the US will rejoin the JCPOA, and then they will have the benefits of both worlds. They will be moving towards having the big arsenal of nuclear weapons while enjoying a wonderful economic situation, selling oil all over the world and having enough money to finance their subversion and terrorism. That's what they believe. They believe, as Kirsten said, that they are getting closer to this pressure that they are putting over is going to work. Now, if some steps are needed in order to take care of the concerns they have about what can happen during this interim period, they can manage it. First of all, they can put a lot of pressure on the population, as they do. And whenever somebody goes out to the street, they can take harsh measures against him. And secondly, they always have the capability of accepting the American conditions of how we should go back to the JCPOA, make some small concessions. This will be regarded by the American administration as a big achievement, and they will go back into the JCPOA. It was maybe a little bit better conditions than the Iranians demand right now. But this is always possible for them. They can solve the problems very easily. I think coming back to what you were discussing earlier on the domestic front, I think one of the things we should say to ourselves, and it's something that really frustrates many Iranians, is that the entire world is worried about whether Iran is going to have nuclear weapons or not. But nobody, they feel, care about their situation. Nobody cares about the suffering that they are going through, not only because of the economic sanctions, but also because of the nature of the regime. Suppressing regime and Raisi becoming president promises that the Iranian people conditions are going to be much worse in the coming 4 years.
I have this question for all of you now. Which is more dangerous, based on your countries as US or Israel, for your country? Iran as a nuclear power, or Iran on the threshold, a nuclear threshold? Listen.
More dangerous, obviously, would be Iran as a nuclear power if they actually had the ability to reach us or to threaten our allies like Israel and our neighbors. That would be more dangerous. But I think an interesting question is, would they be more dangerous as a nuclear power or on the threshold, but maintaining their proxies and missiles? And then the argument can be made on the threshold because the threat is more immediate. So nuclear Iran presents long-term threat. A threshold Iran is an immediate threat because they continue daily to attack the US presence, to threaten both civilians and troops, to attack our partners and allies like the Iraqi military, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, to use their proxies to destabilize governments in the region that have already been discussed. So right now, the more immediate threat comes from them being a threshold power, whereas the long-term strategic threat would be in their position and their international leverage if they did obtain nuclearization.
And this is also the view of the Biden administration?
The Biden administration is mostly concerned with making sure that Iran does not become a nuclear power, because they are concerned about the long-term impact. And because the Biden team has the option of pulling all Americans out of the Middle East, and then the proxies and ballistic missile programs do not become an immediate threat to Americans, whereas a nuclear Iran is a threat to the homeland. So they have to prioritize that first, in their opinion. And they've also made promises to a lot of European neighbors and then to the American public that they would never allow Iran to be a nuclear power. So they must. We can't roll those off because the activities that cause the sanctions to be on are still occurring. So there's no basis for the Biden administration to be able to argue for the roll off. They simply can't lift them. It won't be approved. There's no legal standing for them to be lifted. Whereas Iran is saying, too bad, that's our red line. You must do that. Also, the Biden administration is asking for specific centrifuges to be shut down. And Iran is saying, we don't necessarily want those centrifuges to be shut down. And the Biden administration is saying, we require follow-on talks about new deadlines or new sunset clauses or new nuclear negotiations, since the JCPOA was written with the 2015 timeline, and now most of that is moot. So they would like a discussion about how to extend the agreement. They can't do that they need Iran to only sign on to the original JCPOA, and this is where America has tied its own hands. Because if the Biden administration enters into any agreement that differentiates in the tiniest way from the JCPOA, they have to throw it back to Congress for approval. And there, a massive debate will occur. There will be delays. It might not even be approved. So they're really under pressure, and Tehran knows this, to sign exactly the same JCPOA and then argue with Iran for follow-on talks, in addition to parallel talks about proxies and missiles. Makes it a very difficult negotiating position for the Biden team.
So you think there will be a deal or no deal?
Great question. From what I understand from people inside Iran, the regime wants a deal, but they're not willing to compromise. They're not willing to give up proxies or missiles. They're not willing to have follow-on talks about new limitations. I think they would be willing to extend the monitoring agreement. I believe that their refusal to do that today, this weekend, is because they're trying to pressure Biden to make concessions. I think that would be something they would agree to if there were a deal. They would like a deal because they would like sanctions rollback, but they're not willing to give up some of these things that they think are existentially meaningful to their defense and deterrence. Things like the missiles, things like the proxies, things like the right to develop a nuclear program if they wish.
So we will not have a deal.
Great. I wish I knew. I think if Iran is willing to concede that they will agree to follow on talks, we would have a deal. If the Biden administration is willing to say we will try to work on, we will promise certain kinds of sanctions rollback, we will have a deal. And remember, if you're Iran, you can make the promise to engage in future talks and still never engage in an actual agreement. So you can renew the JCPOA and say, we'll come to the table on talks. And frankly, then you're back in your sweet spot again, because then you're also at the threshold point on proxies and missiles. You look like the good guys for coming to the table and having the conversations, but you never have to actually arrive at an agreement. Meanwhile, you're benefiting from sanctions rollback. So they've
seem like the 2015 deal.
Very much so.
And after the signing the deal, they start their
business as usual.
Right. Right. Ambassador Gold, what is you think more dangerous?
Well, nuclear weapons are clearly the most dangerous aspect of the entire discussion. However, they are also the least probable to be used.
Yeah.
What is the most probable to be used of this entire salad of weaponry we're speaking about? It's really the proxies. And, many people thought when the 2015 deal was concluded that the proxy problem would diminish. There's an incredibly good study by Tony Blair's Institute about the whole role of proxies and the policies of the allied governments towards this question. And again, it was anticipated the proxy problem would diminish. But what happened after the deal was concluded in 2015 was that the number of proxies mushroomed across the Middle East, new proxies with new money to fund them. And I think that's what's going to happen again. And I think that's something which I'm not sure the Western allies are prepared to deal with. For us, We just had a war with Hamas. We will have the threat of Hezbollah in the north. And there'll be others who will join that. I've always wondered what's going to happen to our east, to our Jordanian partners, because I know that many of these proxies have their eyes aimed at Jordan as well. So we have a very dangerous Middle East on the horizon if the West and the negotiators allow the proxy issue to expand, to grow, and not be addressed.
What about the ballistic missiles? Is it dangerous or not?
Well, they're dangerous, but it depends what you put in them. I mean, the missile by itself is a delivery system. If you don't have nuclear weapons, well, you know, a missile is like a rocket. It's something horrible. And we have developed very advanced technologies in missile defense. We have just had an extraordinary breakthrough in Israeli military technology in terms of laser missile defense. You know, shooting a laser costs $80. Shooting a missile is tens of thousands of dollars. And therefore, it changes the economics and the calculus of this kind of warfare in the future. But I'm very concerned about the proxies. The proxy warfare is more probable warfare. And that's something you have to always keep in mind.
Well, you know, the threat, it depends where you are. You are facing Iran, the ballistic missiles is more dangerous for you, not in terms of the range of that, but in terms of the numbers of that. Okay, if you are facing Iran, maybe also the priority or the danger, which one is more dangerous? Or General Yusuf, what is your take?
First of all, I don't think that there is a difference between the two, because I don't believe that Iran is going to stop at the level of threshold country. Once they have the capability, they will produce the weapon, because they realize that they cannot stay there for a long while. If they stay just at the threshold level, somebody is going to take action against them and deprive them from this capability. So it's they wouldn't stay there. They would rush into the weapon itself. And that's why, by the way, in 2015 and before 2015, the major disagreement between Israel and the United States was about this issue specifically. We said Iran should not have the capability to produce nuclear weapon, should not become a threshold country. And the Americans said, and they're still saying most of the time, sometimes they speak differently, but most of the time say, Iran should not have nuclear weapon, which is something a little bit different. And I hope that they will adopt our approach, which says that Iran should not have the capability to produce nuclear weapons. And what worries me is that once they have the capability, they will have the weapon. And this is going to have an impact on everything. For example, this issue of proxies, they will feel much more emboldened if they know that Iran has nuclear weapons. They would feel that they have some backing from the Iranians that would deter anybody from taking action against them. That's one thing that we should take into account. And also, the Iranians themselves are going to feel much more emboldened because, as we said before, the purpose of all this effort to acquire nuclear weapons is to move forward, not just to defend Iran against the potential threats. It's spreading the ideology that they are up to. And that's why even when they have just the capability to produce nuclear weapon, in my mind, it's extremely dangerous and we should not allow them to get there. And actually, this is what's happening right now. What all kinds of events hint to is that somebody is trying to prevent Iran from having the capability to produce nuclear weapons. And most people believe that this is us, but somebody is trying to do that. And the reason is very clear, because they get closer to having this capability.
That leads me to the question that for all of you, what are the choices of regional and global powers on each of these potential scenarios, either Iran on the threshold, nuclear threshold, or Iran as a nuclear power? Kristen.
The U.S., in terms of the threshold, is doing what it can right now with negotiations and an attempt to pressure Iran to agree to follow on talks. Otherwise, it will become an issue of fighting essentially insurgencies in each country. For instance, they could do something on the proxy activity in Iraq. We could ask the Iraqi government to invite the PMUs to talks about their grievances. Why are you loyal to a regime in Tehran instead of to your government here? What we're hearing from some folks on the ground in Iraq is that in many cases, this is an issue of service provision. Well, if that can be addressed by the federal government and those PMUs can be more closely integrated into the Iraqi military, then you know which PMUs are truly loyal to Iran or truly following an ideological leader rather than a political or a military commander. If you remove those then from the Iraqi military, they essentially become an insurgency. So they no longer receive the salaries from the Iraqi government, and they no longer receive the protections they have being a part of an official state's armed forces. This may change their calculus. It also opens up additional authorities for the US and other countries to act against them if need be. So that's one opportunity for reducing proxy activity if we stay in the threshold status in one particular country. The US negotiations by assigning an envoy to Yemen is another attempt at addressing the proxy activity because the US is aware it's very possible that a deal might not be reached. And therefore, no future talks would happen, and Iran will continue to not only supply, but probably ramp up its proxy activity. So you see the US trying to do things around the region, one by one, case by case, theater by theater, to address the proxy threat. If we do have a deal, that won't change. There will still need to be this theater by theater attempt to address the proxy threat. We work closely with other governments on what we call the rat lines, trying to reduce the transmission of actual equipment and arms to these proxies, with partner governments to try to reduce the ways that Iran is able to reach their friends abroad. The problem is with things like 3D printing, we're seeing the increase of capability by each of these proxies themselves. All I really need is blueprints. So it's not as easy as intercepting truckloads of munitions or dowels full of GPS and engines for drones. You now have to intercept somebody who just has a blueprint hidden in their hat. Becomes a bit more difficult. But the US is still taking this very seriously and working every single day to try to interrupt the ability of proxies to act against our friends in the region, while they try to address this really tough position in Vienna with the nuclear negotiations.
I think US in a tough position between pivoting, not pivoting, realignment, it's troops, lowering its fingerprints. I mean, look to Afghanistan and what's going on. And I think also now we are entering the era of the drones, which is another issue. I mean, even if Iran is not a nuclear power, it has its capability to develop drones or to send it to its proxies wherever they are, which is also another issue. It's a complicated issue for us, for the Israeli, for the American, for the European. I mean, I think for the whole world.
The drone question is really problematic now. We've seen at least 8 attacks in Iraq alone in the last 2 months. And in each attack, the Iranian proxy has used a different model of drone, which will require a different mitigation system. So you would have to have off the charts numbers of defeat technologies in order to have, defeated each one of these. We're also seeing a big uptick in the sophistication of these drones. The one that crashed this weekend into a house had about a 5-foot wingspan. It had fuel bladders that were large enough to take it really wide ranging. It had, we think, 3 GPS systems. It had a German engine. It had a 35, well, I won't get into the details, but it was a pretty sophisticated drone. And the first one we've seen like this. We know it had SATCOM technology, which we see Iran put on their drones all the time. But it's like each time they launch a drone, they're experimenting with pushing the envelope a bit more. How much can this drone do? How far can this get us? What payload can this accommodate? How close can we get? Can we get through defeat systems with this? So the attacks are one piece, but what's even more important is this library of knowledge they're building about the ability of the nations around them to defend against these.
Wonderful. Ambassador Good, what is your take on that? What is the choices?
Well, if we're speaking about drones, I mean, I was astounded.
No, I'm speaking about what is the choices for the either in become a nuclear power or nuclear threshold. What the reaction of the Israelis is going to be?
Well, I think we have made clear that we will not live with a nuclear Iran. And
you will wipe it?
What?
You will wipe them? What you will do?
I don't use language out of Texas. You know, I would just tell you that it's something which is our national security doctrine does not tolerate. And but I think these lesser threats, which I call more highly probable threats, like the drones, are becoming a new part of the strategic landscape that we have to address. It all costs a lot of money, but it's something urgent. I mean, when I saw a Houthi drone attack the center of Riyadh, this was just 2 years ago, I said, what is going on here? That, you know, Saudi Arabia, with all the money it has spent on its national security, on its defense, can't prevent a drone attack. And you know what? It's not just Saudi Arabia. I don't think most countries could prevent a drone attack like that. And I think we have to increase the sophistication of defense to deny their offensive capability. And I mentioned a little while ago Israeli developments in laser technology. We were working on lasers back in the mid 2000s with the United States in New Mexico testing field. But now our lasers are much better, much more sophisticated, and can deny the advantages that the offense has had over the last number of years, which we have all suffered from. And that might stabilize international security through technology.
Thank you. General Kuperwas.
I think we have
the last
That's of the Balkans. Well, I think we should work harder on deterrence. It's making it clear to the Iranians that it's not in their interest to move forward. And I think they understand it. This language is well understood by the Iranians. They appreciate people who are ready to take action in order to defend themselves. And they know that, especially when Israel and its Arab friends work together, the capabilities are much stronger than if anybody works alone. Our first address should be the Europeans. I mean, I don't understand why Europe should be appeasing Iran and ignoring the Arabs. That makes no sense.
Because of the Iranian lobbies. I don't know how they will work when the Moderator now is leaving the seat. I think they will become more weak, but...
Maybe, but well, it's very strange. I mean, the Europeans totally ignore the Arabs. They dance to the Iranian flute and ignore the Arabs. I think it's something that has to change. Once the Iranians understand that there's going to be some change in Europe, it's something, and they are close to forcing the Europeans to rethink about their approach. So I think this is very important. On top of that, deterrence is built on clarifying to the Iranians that there is a determination in the international community, especially the Western world and the Arab world and Israel, not to allow them to have the capability to produce nuclear weapons, and that steps will be taken in order to ensure that, be it isolation, be it clandestine activity, be it in the worst case, some kinetic activity. And this message should be... Is
the military option on the Israeli table?
Yes, I think yes. The chief of staff has clarified.
Without the acceptance of US?
Well, this is the big debate right now in Israel, whether we should speak with the Americans about it and update them before we do anything or not. But by and large, I think everybody understands that we cannot put our security in the hands of the United States, and we have to be able to defend ourselves by ourselves, even though we want to have the best of cooperation with the Americans and with our Arab friends as well. That's, we are looking forward to any cooperation because we believe that if we cooperate, our chances to get our goals without resorting to harsh measures are greater.
Excellent. And you have the Iron Dome, we don't have. I would say thank you very much.
We can help in this respect also by fighting the drones. Not only we fight drones both with Iron Dome and from the air and with laser. And we have a variety of ways that nobody else has proven. You know, in the last round of atrocities with Gaza, they launched 7 drones against us, and one drone came from Iraq or Syria, an Iranian drone. 8 drones altogether. All of them were intercepted before they managed to do anything.
I think both we have to discuss it with the US. And with this, I'm coming to the end of our webinar. Apologize for our viewers that I couldn't take because time is very tight, couldn't take their questions, and truly enjoyed the discussion. Thank you very much. Kristen, Ambassador Gold, General Cooper Wasser, thank you very much for joining us. And I'm asking our followers and viewers to exit this webinar and register again for the next webinar. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
now welcome you again to the second panel under theme of nuclear gestation or a nuclear weapon via Zoom, and also being live streamed on EPC's YouTube channel and other social media platforms. And for those whom they are the Arab following us, they announced that there is an interpretation. You can click on the icon and you can hear the interpretation in Arabic. And now I'm welcoming our distinguished guest speakers, General Udi Dikel, Managing Director and Senior Researcher Fellow of the Institute for National Security Studies. And also pleasure to have Dr. Cornelis Adibar, non-resident fellow at Carnegie Europe. And last but not least, Mr. Mark Finwood, head of Armed Proliferation and Diplomatic Tradecraft at Geneva Center for Security Policy and a former French diplomat. As you know, the Middle East region in general and the Gulf region in particular are facing the repercussions of what can be described as the nuclear gestation and as a result of Iran becoming a nuclear threshold state and its inability to effectively reach the stage of producing the nuclear bomb. This gestation has until now several negative repercussions on the region and the world. GCC countries were among the top national affected by these repercussions, either on economic domain or on regional security and stability. Today, some argue that the negative repercussion resulting from this nuclear gestation might not be less worse than the repercussion resulting from Iran acquiring the nuclear bomb itself, at least from the point of view of GCC interests. Iran continues to brandish the nuclear option while various international parties, especially the US and Europe, continue to provide concessions to the Iranian regime on different regional issues out of fear that the regime in Tehran will go for the nuclear weapon. This situation is increasingly harming Arab and GCC interests, and I believe Israel as well. In light of repercussions resulting from the nuclear gestation, the likely impact if Iran surpasses this gestation, whether by taking a step backward and leaving a safe distance from the nuclear bomb or moving forward with more escalation. It is imperative to ask the following questions, which I will address to my guest, and I will start with General Udi. General Udi, welcome to EPC webinar. And in your view, which actors do impose a red line on Iran's acquisition of a nuclear weapon or its pursuit of becoming a nuclear threshold state, and why? Are the Arab countries' interests different from those of Israel and the US regarding Iran acquisition of the nuclear bomb?
If I can say something, Iran is already a threshold state, a nuclear threshold country. Even when we speak about months from decision that they can break to a bomb, this is a threshold situation. And I would like to say, because I didn't listen to the previous session, but I would like to say that I am not sure today, because we are after 6 rounds of negotiation in Vienna. I'm not sure that Iran is really would like to go back to the JCPOA, because Iran used the time of negotiation to advance its nuclear project and require knowledge and all the things which necessary for the development of the nuclear capabilities. Maybe you know they have a program that they need the time to check other things during that process of negotiation. And the most, of course, difficult issue concerns the future of the advanced centrifuges and the situation which the enriching uranium up to 60%, and the amount of enriching uranium today is almost for 3 bombs, and there is a producing of metallic fuel. So they are going forward, and nobody understands which they use that time. They are not wait for somebody, okay? They use that time, and they are not. I'm not see any eager situation in the Iranian side, and to achieve an agreement or to go back to the JCPOA, even from the economic point of view. So in any case, as I see the situation, I believe that Iran prefer to be a nuclear threshold state with all the capabilities that they need, and the option in its end, but not to expose that they have already nuclear bomb, since that it will put Iran under the threat of somebody attack, especially US attack. Maybe we will discuss later on the ability of US attack, and complete isolation from the international and regional system. So for them, it's better that in their hand there is the decision if they break through or not, that they are on the threshold point, and they can achieve most of the goals of deterrence and the freedom of activity all over the Middle East, because if somebody will do something to Iran, so they will have the excuse to break through the bomb. And this is very serious situation for all of us. You know, we have strategic dialogue with all the countries, the P5+2, let's call it like that. And we try to convince them about the Iranian activity all over the Middle East. It's not important for them. Nobody pay attention about the Iranian negative activity in our region. Everybody focusing about the nuclear and the JCPOA. But what about all the other activities of Iran? This is not on the table. But if Iran achieving the position of threshold nuclear state, which now they have the freedom of activity, operating all its proxies, attacking, American and other locations here, and of course Israel, from my point of view, and it will be very difficult for somebody to create real response to that challenges that Iran pose the region, because everybody will be afraid of that. If something will not good for Iran, they will cross the threshold and become a nuclear state. And this is an issue that we have to understand and to take into consideration today, because otherwise it will be too late to engage with the new situation.
Do you share the same view, Mark, with the Udi, that Iran really on the threshold, or?
Thank you. Of course, with all due respect, I will beg to differ slightly. I would call or conclude, if I had to lecture to make, I would jump to my conclusion and I'd say that Iran is a sort of quasi threshold state or would-be threshold state. I know that the concept of breakout capability was at the heart of the negotiation of the JCPOA, this capacity to produce enough fissile material to make a nuclear weapon. Now, in the history of nuclear weapons, of course, there was no case when one country that wanted to develop nuclear weapons was satisfied, was content with producing only the fissile material for only one nuclear weapon. If you want to do it seriously, like Israel or like North Korea, of course, you have to plan to be able to manufacture at least 30 to 50 or up to 80 nuclear weapons. So is Iran, even if it wanted to be in that position, of course, would be far from having this capability. Now, it's true that, as we know, the purpose of the JCPOA was to deprive Iran from this capacity to produce highly enriched uranium in high percentage of purity. So it was kept below 5%, which is the level which is used for civilian uses and energy power plants, and in volumes that would not allow Iran to enrich further up to 20 and up to 90%, which is the weapons grade material. And on the other hand, also deprive Iran from the capacity to produce plutonium, which also could be used for making a nuclear weapon. Now, we know that since the US withdrew from the agreement, after 1 year of so-called strategic patience, Iran started to announce clearly that it would stop complying with all these restrictions. So first there was a first set of measures announced by the government, which was presented as incremental, controlled, reversible measures to lift some of the restrictions under the JCPOA. And then there was a second set of measures announced by or decided by the parliament more recently in December 2020 as a result of course, the failure of the Trump maximum pressure and in order to put pressure on the new administration to lift the sanctions and allow return to full compliance with the JCPOA. Now, of course, these measures are more worrying than the previous ones because precisely they don't have only a symbolic content or dimension, they are actually demonstrating the capacity of Iran to enrich up to 60%, even if this level is of absolutely no use for making a nuclear weapon. And by the way, since this was announced, Iran started to reduce the number of centrifuges producing at that level because precisely what it needs for other purposes, fuel for the research reactor is production at 20%. So it started to reduce the production of 60% arrangement. And it's true that Iran also announced production of uranium metal of 20% so-called purity. But again, this is not very helpful for a nuclear weapons program. It actually diverts resources from such a program, and it's more for research, to produce the so-called siliciide fuel, which again would help produce fuel and isotopes at the research reactor in Tehran. So, this is nothing really, news groundbreaking. Iran has worked in the past on metal production, which was under the safeguards of the IAEA, and even if, again, symbolically it demonstrates this capacity, it doesn't have an immediate impact on moving to a nuclear program?
Well, Mark, this depends where you stay. Okay, I think it is an issue for the Gulfies and for the Israeli, and you are away from that, a little bit far, and even the missile range, if it will not reach this. Dr. Adib, what or becoming a nuclear threshold state and stopping at that stage?
Thank you very much, Dr. Al-Khatbi, for the question, and thank you also for leading us right into the heart of the matter. When you said at the beginning that nuclear gestation, as you called it also for the title, I would use the more old-fashioned term nuclear proliferation, is a problem for the entire region. I fully agree. And it does have to do with the advances that Iran has made on nuclear energy, and including the readiness to produce a nuclear weapon, possibly. But this is not the only reason why this is of urgency. It also has to do with the other nuclear programs which have sprung up in the region, notably in your country, the United Arab Emirates, but also in neighboring Saudi Arabia. But speaking of this regional dimension, let me just take issue with one thing that General Udi said at the beginning, that no one cares about the regional escalation. Who has watched European Iran policy for years now, I strongly disagree. The Europeans started out in 2003 with negotiations with Iran on the nuclear file, but also on other baskets, as they were called, the security basket, the political basket. They wanted to tackle these issues because they did not think that a focus on the nuclear program alone would be useful. I don't have to recount the story, how difficult it was to get other world powers to the negotiation table. And in the course of getting them to the table, this regional dimension was fully dropped, and it was decided to focus only on the nuclear program, which worked fine in terms of compartmentalization, as it was called. You just focus on the issue where you think you can find an agreement. And as we all know, this agreement was eventually found with the nuclear deal of 2015. But then again, the JCPOA was meant to be a stepping stone to regional cooperation also. And at that moment, the Europeans again embarked on a process to talk with Iran about the situation in Yemen, the E4 process, bringing on Italy on the way. So they have always had the regional picture in their mind. They are not, no doubt about this, the European Union is not a powerful actor in the region. Some member states are definitely more powerful when it comes to bilateral relations. So that's an impediment that the European Union as a whole has, and I'm not going to be shy about this. But it is the intention to tackle these issues, in particular with the regional dimension. And if anything, the last 3 years, ever since the United States left the nuclear deal, has shown us how intertwined both the nuclear file and the regional security file are. So that is something that is on policymakers' minds. And it is something that ought to be tackled. And I have to say, the main reason why it couldn't be tackled over the past 3-4 years is because the United States withdrew, because Arab countries have not made peace with the JCPOA, because they did not want to take this as a building block for whatever regional cooperation could become realized afterwards. Taking the nuclear threat off the table, that was the idea of the JCPOA, to be able to deal with the more conventional regional threats. And we are still in this position where we don't have one, we still have the nuclear threat because the negotiations aren't advancing. And we also have a worsening of the regional security situation.
Well, there are, I mean, you can debate this from our side. The Arab, they did not even invite it to the table. they are teethless on that. And the problem that you didn't take it with that deal, there is no guarantees that you will move. You didn't put conditions that with this also you have to move to the regional files, to ballistic missiles. That's why, and also Iran violated that deal by going to enrichment. So if the blame will be on that, those who initiated that deal, they didn't make it really successful considering all the issues. They emboldened Iran more and more, and now we are seeing that Iran is moving to the nuclear threshold and might be a nuclear power. General Udi, in your view, which is more risky to Arab and Israeli interests? The current nuclear or he, as Dr. Admar want to say, its proliferation, or Iran actual acquisition of the nuclear weapon? Is it possible at the moment to talk about the option of involvement in an Israeli-led project to strike Iran and nuclear facilities to slow the progress of Tehran and nuclear project? And what would be the response of Iran and its regional proxies in case that strike was conducted?
Okay, before that, I would like to respond to 2 points that our colleagues said. There is no any reason to enrich uranium up to 60% for civilian purposes. And Iran does, this is now what the main focus of Iran, first. Second, we checked the things that I said about the regional activity. We checked with the information of the governments of the P4+1, not the US, the P4+1. How many times the governments, the cabinets discussed the issue of the Iranian activity in our area, in basically Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and there is support of all of those proxies. Very, 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 very few times during the last almost 10 years. So this is not the main issue of the international community. Second, about the ballistic missiles, because you asked about the ballistic missiles, is not a mistake. When the supreme leader of Iran gave an order that the radius of operation of the missiles will not be longer than 2,000 kilometers, because 2,000 kilometers cover very well the Middle East, let's say, countries like Israel and your country. If this
and reach Europe,
but not Europe. Well, only, yes, the eastern side of Europe, which is not the way which Iran would like to create any kind of threat. We try all the time to understand the logic behind the Iranian decision, that they are very rational and they know how to explain their positions in the West, especially their foreign minister, which is, he has a magic discussion with all of the rest of the world, but we have to check and to see the situation on the ground. And the situation on the ground, we see all the time that Iran every day build up the military or the war machine in Syria, in Lebanon, and you can explain what happened in your side of the Gulf, and what kind of activity against vessels they are doing, and using UAVs from Yemen and other places. And it's Iran, they are very nice country with only peaceful intention. So
okay, so now
I don't.
Back to my question.
I don't believe that there is possible. I hope that there is no possibility that Iran will achieve nuclear capabilities, because somebody have to stop them before doing that. So I know that the dream in Israel, for some people in Israel, I'm not sure about all the Israelis, that the US will do the mission if it will be clear that Iran decide to achieve nuclear weapons. But if something like that can happen, first of all, I assume that the US will not attack before having the smoking gun, that Iran is very close to weapon devices, that they can use it as a nuclear warhead for their ballistic missiles. And so it's very important to achieve the smoking guns, which is not so easy to do that. Second, the US will not do anything. Even all the presidents of the US declared that there will be no doubt that the United States is determined to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, that the US will operate without international support by international community on the basis of understanding that all the policy options have been exhausted, and it's very difficult to decide, because every time somebody believes that maybe we will be able to convince Iran not to go the next steps forward.
But what if Israeli took decision to strike? What do you think that the reaction of the Iranian, and what is their ability to mobilize their proxies?
So Israel have capabilities, not like the US, but have capabilities, some secrecy capabilities, settled, and the other secrecy capabilities, but also other capabilities, conventional capabilities to attack Iran nuclear facilities. I am not sure what will be the outcome. The outcome maybe will postpone the Iran back to some years back and to start again. It will not change the Iranian intention. In any case, if there is Iranian intention, it will not change the Iranian intention.
But somebody will debate you, Odi. Why, if Israeli has the capability, why they did not do it?
Because in any case, Israel, especially now, because we have a new government in Israel, at least, Israel prefer that this issue will not be only the responsibility of Israel, because this has to be the responsibility of the international community. And basically, Israel has to support the international efforts in order to convince Iran not to do that, not to jump and to achieve nuclear capabilities. And
great. I have to give also.
And it's better that it will be under the international, cover, that this is the international responsibility.
I have to move to Mark, because also I want to give everybody a space to that's okay. Mark, given Iran's regional geostrategic project, can Tehran nuclear program be seen as part of a defensive or an offensive strategy?
Now, we know that this program was launched a long time ago by the Shah with the support of the United States, even active support and assistance of the United States to develop a modern economy based on nuclear peaceful energy. And of course, that was very tempting for Iran due to the regional security environment to be tempted to manufacture nuclear weapons, not so much because of Israel, but because of the Iraqi program under Saddam Hussein. And this is when actually Iran was seriously considering this, and this has been confirmed by the United States National Intelligence Estimate in 2007, that it stopped precisely in 2003 after the fall of the Saddam Hussein regime. And this was confirmed by the IAEA in 2015 with the bilateral agreement between IAEA and Iran, which was endorsed by the Board of Governors and by the Security Council, etc. So there was this international understanding that there were some temptation at one stage to manufacture nuclear weapons, and that it stopped because Iran understood that it would not be in its interest to cross the threshold. It would make Iran a target. It will start proliferation in the region, because it's clear that Saudi Arabia has announced that it will follow suit, perhaps Turkey. So it would create chaos, which certainly would not play in the interest of Iran. And we are in the same situation. This scenario, this hypothetical question that you asked, the general is still, of course, valid, but certainly we would be close to the self-fulfilling prophecy, because if Iran is attacked on its territory, whether it's the United States, Israel, or coalition, I would say more than what is going on at the moment, which I would qualify more as skirmishes in Syria, in Iraq. But if Iran feels attacked on its own territory, then it will have a wonderful excuse, a wonderful pretext to say we're under attack, and just like any other nuclear weapon state, we need this nuclear weapon to defend our national security. So in that sense, such an approach, a military strike, or even a hardening of sanctions, as Trump did, would be not only ineffective but counterproductive.
Well, Mark, I will debate this with you. I think neither lifting the sanctions stopped Iran from going in enrichment, or threatening Iran. Both has been used as excuse for more proliferation, more, what about ballistic missiles, which you are not concerned about? This is in terms of their numbers. What about nothing stops that, if you would say. And in the previous webinar, one speaker said, no, being on nuclear threshold, this is more benefit Iran more. And this is what's more favorite, because it will give us a chance, an opportunity to blackmail everybody. Everybody will run after Iran, so not to move or to be a nuclear power. This is more profitable for Iran, rather than being a nuclear power, then be exposed to more sanctions from everybody, all major powers, including Europe. Dr. Cornelis, the nuclear agreement would be the issue that Rice's government must have a clear vision on. And Rice's position on the nuclear agreement, negative or positive, would be crucial and would have clear implication for all other issues, despite an attempt by Iranian president-elect during his first press conference to underestimate the importance of such deal. What is your view about this?
Thank you, and thanks for raising the nuclear agreement once more. It reminds me of one thing that General Udi said, and which I would like to strongly underline, even though I think we disagree on his interpretation. He said Israel has to support the international effort that Iran does not develop a nuclear weapon. And I wish Israel had supported the international effort that should have prevented Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, which was the JCPOA. But Israel did not support this. To the contrary, it tried to obstruct the implementation of the JCPOA. Now we are in the position where the JCPOA is meant to be revived, meant by all those powers which have signed it some time ago. And I don't think that the new president is the most decisive voice in this field. Yes, he has come out as a critic of the West in general, as an enemy of Israel, no doubt about that. That's just in line with what is demanded by the Islamic Republic. But he has also, because the supreme leader has given the green light for these negotiations, also President-elect Raisi will be supportive of an agreement if and when it comes about. The main idea, I guess, from an Iranian perspective is that the agreement might be negotiated before the new government takes office, because then, if anything like sanctions relief comes into play, this will be to the benefit of the then newly elected government. But any blame that could be posed on the previous government for actually having negotiated this. So the tactic of the Western powers, but Russia and China included, to finish these negotiations before the Iranian elections obviously did not play out. Now they will try to finish these negotiations in what is called the lame duck period for precisely these reasons. But the question whether or not Iran will agree to a revival of the JCPOA is not in the hands of the newly elected president. It wasn't in the hands of the old outgoing president. It has always been the Supreme National Security Council, which is the main consultative body for these matters. And once this body has deliberated and the supreme leader has taken a position, this is what the Islamic Republic will implement. So in that sense, if you want to see some good signs in the recent election, then you can say that Iran is likely to speak more with one voice. We won't hear different voices. We won't hear an eloquent US-educated foreign minister speaking and saying different things than people at home would say. But we can expect a more hardline, but in itself unified government approach. And that could, as I say, if you want to find something positive, that could be something positive for all those who have to deal with Iran, that it's clear where the Islamic Republic stands.
Well, I mean, the winning of the hardliner wasn't because that not reaching the deal. It is the choice of Khamenei. I mean, it's not because of the others that now I see some Iranian supporting Rouhani, that because of that, those hardliners came to rule Iran. It's because something internal. So it has nothing to do with external. And Iran, as I said in the previous panel, now choose its way, pivoting to the East. It's not caring about the West. Signing this strategic agreement with China, it means doesn't care. What they care more is about lifting the sanctions. It's not about signing that deal or fulfilling their promises to that deal. And I don't have to repeat that they did not fulfill their. General Udi, I know that you want to comment on what Dr. Cornelis said, but I really want to ask you from your military background, if Iran declare itself, you don't like it, but if it declare itself as a nuclear state, which model do you think it will take or it will follow? The North Korean model, the Pakistani model, the Indian model, which model in your point of view? Or you are muted.
One sentence that I said that I prefer the international responsibility, but it doesn't mean that I prefer the JCPOA as is. And nobody discuss the ability, there is speaking about longer and stronger. Nobody discuss now what about longer and stronger. And nobody discussed about the idea that I said in the beginning, that maybe Iran doesn't want to really to go back to the JCPOA, because they found the way how to live with sanctions. So they have time, and there is something which one of our main lessons learned, that the timeline of the Iranian is not the same as the timeline of us, of Israel. I'm not responsible for the timeline of others. I believe that the model, I don't know which model, because that will be new model, that will be Iranian model. And it will affect the region, because we used to speak in the past. Now we can start again, discuss the issue of the domino effect, which is the collapse of the proliferation regime, a nuclear race in our region, that other countries will try to achieve nuclear capabilities, because each one of those countries need that to protect themselves, or, guarantees that Iran will not use. I know that discussions all over the world that the nuclear weapon is not in order to use it, in order to achieve other things, but not to use it. But who can take the risk about that in the region? So other countries will try to acquire nuclear capabilities. So we will find now with the Middle East, with many countries which trying to achieve nuclear capabilities. It will change all the arms race in the region. It affect the stability in the region. It's very difficult will be to create the rule of the game of the new situation. Okay, what is the meaning of that? That Iran have a nuclear capability, that they can give nuclear umbrella for the extreme rogue functions, that the proxies that they operate all over the Middle East. What those, in the previous discussion, you spoke about the PMU in Iraq. What the PMU will decide to do if they know that there's the cover of the Iranian nuclear umbrella. So we will find another situation, dramatic change in our region, which is not so stable in any case. And because of that, it's so important to prevent Iran from achieving the nuclear capabilities.
Okay, back to you, Mark. As for the European-Iranian relations, well, we got a notice from Variety. I'm saying, as for the European-Iranian relations, issues raised about the new Iranian president might complicate relations between the two sides and end state of tranquility which these relations enjoyed during the moderate government. These issues include Rice's involvement in some political assassination in the 80s. How Europe is going to deal with that?
Well, as Cornelius recalled, of course, the Europeans were the first to start this negotiation process back in 2003, because they were afraid that after Iraq, Iran would be the next target of the United States military intervention. And there were voices like John Bolton, who were in favor of going forward to attack Iran. And they were afraid that, of course, the Europeans were not so far, away from the region. We were afraid of the potential consequences on Europe of, this chaos that would have resulted. And so they have still very strong stakes in ensuring full compliance with the JCPOA, which, despite all its
regardless if the racist government does not want?
Well, again, it remains to be seen, because they have such a strong interest in having the sanctions lifted that obviously they have no other choice than to accept the whatever package of mutual agreements will be concluded in Vienna. And this, of course, this is very strongly supported by the Europeans. You know, they've tried to mediate between Trump and Iran, and this hasn't succeeded, even to modestly alleviate the pressure of sanctions on Iran. So obviously, it's in everybody's interest now to renew or to revive the JCPOA and maybe to open the door for new negotiations. And Iran has declared that, of course, they didn't want to put everything on the table now to complicate the restoration of the JCPOA, but they're open for regional talks, including on ballistic missiles, provided they are not, you know, singled out or the only target of international pressure. You know, as was recalled, this rule of 2,000 kilometer limit on the range of ballistic missiles, this could be accepted as a norm by the region, but it would require some form of negotiation or discussions. And there, you know, there is so many missed opportunities in the region. I will not go back too, you know, far away in history, but you know, there was a draft agreement on making the Gulf region nuclear weapon-free zone, which of course included the Gulf countries and Iran. And this was refused by Egypt because precisely it didn't include Israel. Then there is this long proposal, actually, initially from Iran, then supported by Egypt, of a WMD free zone in the Middle East, which has been rejected, postponed, objected to by the US or Israel. And this is an opportunity. Now there's a UN General Assembly annual conference on this issue, that this is the best possible framework that at least that could be used as an opportunity to address all these questions. You know, there are threat perceptions in the region from the Gulf countries vis-a-vis Iran, but also from Iran vis-a-vis the, you know, other countries in the region. And look around, you know, look at the map. They are surrounded by American bases or forces. So you have to understand each other's position if you want to make progress towards, you know, confidence-building measures, disarmament, just like Europe has done during the Cold War, and now it's a regional peace.
Well, Mark, I've asked one Iranian a question. What if you acquire the nuclear power, okay? And you will be the hegemon power, and that's it. What is the ultimate you will reach? Then, based on your, what are you saying, that feeling the threats, this is what pushed Iran towards more expansion and its with its militia in the region and with ballistic missiles. Okay, I asked, what if? And you can ask the Iranian, you will be back to your border, you will leave Syria, you will leave Lebanon, you will leave Yemen, you will leave Iraq, your neighbor? He said, no, of course not. Okay, so it's obvious it's not because of the threat. Okay, what the threat can GCC vis-a-vis Iran? Who is threatening who? I think no, we are denying that the fact that Iran has its regional project for hegemony. Okay, regardless, I mean, this is the justification of using Israel, using US, using whoever, the GCC, to project its power on its neighborhood. In Iraq, it's an obvious case for that. So I don't buy this, Mark. I have a question for Dr. Karnais. Now, the American position on Iran's presidential elections might be a forefront for the potential confrontation with the conservative government in Tehran. And this would also reflect on Iran's relations with Europe, because there is a clear convergence between the EU and Washington on the Iranian issue, and an almost identical position on the nuclear issue. What do you think about that?
Let me answer first your question and then make a comment. I think there is less differences between the United States and the European governments now than with the previous US administration, that's for sure. There is still a need for the current US administration to come around and say what beyond the reinstatement of the JCPOA they would like to achieve and how. So there is room for discussion with the Europeans, how one should go about the next steps if and when one reaches the revival of the JCPOA. But there is also common ground when it comes to looking at Iran, the domestic politics of Iran, the poor human rights record of the country. So I think by and large, and especially with a more hardline government, there will be more reason for the United States and the Europeans to work together than previously. So no doubt about that. What should they work on? I'm coming back to the question of regional security, because well, we've said before, the Europeans have made proposals in this regard. Also, Russia has made a proposal for regional security, but anything that is very much at this level of what in Europe is the OSCE, the Conference on Security and Cooperation, like a very high-level hard security body, is, for me at least, out of question for the moment. So one would have to start with much smaller steps. The dialogue between the UAE and Tehran on maritime security is something that I could see as a place where dialogue can gestate, if you like, a birthplace of dialogue. Even talking about enriching uranium, and General Udi was right to mention the dangerous levels of enrichment that Iran has reached these days. What if one could agree, the countries around the Persian Gulf could agree on a highly enriched uranium-free zone, where no country around the Persian Gulf enriches to levels 20% or above? This is something.
Who is enriching? We don't have. Well, we have a civil.
Exactly. So you have nothing to lose. But for example, Saudi Arabia wants to keep that option open. So there is
because the Iranian also have that option. So
right. So, but I mean, start somewhere. Start with a practical dialogue, and that's if the levels of enrichment of Iran are worrisome, then this is maybe an issue to tackle. I could imagine talks about, as I said, maritime security, environmental affairs, around nuclear safety. I mean, just come to think of it, that the Iranian nuclear reactor in Bushehr is much closer to your capital than to Tehran. So there is an urgent need for these countries in the region to talk about disaster prevention.
Yeah, but Dr. Cornelius,
yes.
I mean, you cannot take what you like and you leave what you don't like, okay? There are issues also. You have to put everything on the table. You need regional cooperation, or you have to have consensus on this is from our side, I'm talking about the Gulf, on the ballistic missiles and on regional activities. I mean, you cannot take everything and you leave, that's what Raisi said. There is no discussion about the ballistic missiles or any regional activities. I mean, it cannot be. It takes two to dance that tango. It takes two ways. It's not now from the Iranian view. It's one way. Well, what about ours? Interest. It's not only about Iranians. Yes, the maritime security is our interest. The climate change, our interest, the environment, it's all both interests, but there are also other things. You cannot neglect them and you cannot ignore them.
I don't want to ignore them, and I'm not proposing to ignore them. I just say you have to start somewhere. And so if there is an agreement on to talk about some of those issues, why not start those talks? and always keep in mind that there is more on the table, that there is more to solve in the long run, but start somewhere with issues that are in your interest, as you just said, that are also in Iran's interest to deal with, and find these areas of agreement. I don't think that you can put out 20 issues and say, we're not going to agree on any one of these until we agree on all of these. That's not feasible, but that is not the approach that one should take.
Yeah, but you cannot separate the files, and you need guarantor for what you reach in each step. And this is the task of the global powers, that you cannot go on negotiation forever, and the outcomes. Who will guarantee that outcomes we reach that will be fulfilled from mainly, I think, the Iranian side. Now I will move to the question, and I address it to all of you. And I will start with General Udi. General Udi, what are the choices of regional and global powers? And this is, I asked the previous also, on each of these potential scenarios. If Iran on the nuclear threshold, or Iran as a nuclear power, what is the choice? What is the scenarios we can do?
I believe that we have to be ready for the scenario that Iran is will threshold the nuclear state, and to understand what are the consequences for all of us in that situation. I think that also the international community have to take into consideration that there is no return to the JCPOA, not because of the international community, not because of the US new administration, because that Iran is not ready to go back to the JCPOA. And what is the meaning of go back to the JCPOA? We didn't discuss it. And what we cannot play back all the knowledge and the things that already happened in Iran, never mind. So I believe that, and this is something which we discussed between us even, that we have to think to build up the regional cooperation and how to engage with the situation that Iran is a threshold state with all of the negative implications to the region.
So you don't want to admit that Iran can move to a nuclear power? What is the choices?
As you said before, I believe that Iran clever enough to try to achieve all the benefits to be in threshold because they don't want to be isolated from all of the world. And if they cross to nuclear, there is a risk for them that they will be isolated from all the rest of the world. And as we spoke before, maybe somebody will attack them and their capabilities. So for them, it's better to be in the threshold state and to achieve all the benefits from that and to achieve the influence all over the region by saying, if somebody is not behaved the way that Iran would like him to behave, they can cross and they can do. And we have to consider that will be the next era. And we have to think what we can do together in order to achieve stability and to tackle the new situation.
Sure, thank you. Mark.
Yes, well, of course, the Middle East is special for many aspects, many regards, but it's not the only region in conflict or in crisis where you have a proliferation crisis. Look at South Korea and North Korea. You look at South Asia with India and Pakistan, with China. So
yeah, but they did not sign.
No,
PT, then they.
Sure. But the conclusion is the same: is that in a region of conflict, when you have a proliferation crisis, you cannot expect to solve this crisis unless you do something about the conflict. So this is where the international community has, of course, major stakes and major responsibility to support any talks. And it's very good that Iran is now talking with Saudi Arabia. Perhaps they will try and solve the Gulf in Yemen, the war in Yemen, because this is certainly more strategic for Saudi than for Iran, which is just using this as a means of pressure. And of course, the Abraham Accords are also welcome because they create this rapprochement between Arab countries and Israel. And now we know that the US, it puts on the table reconciliation between Israel and the Palestinians. So unless something is done to reduce the tensions, to solve some of the conflicts which have been going on for years, nothing will be achievable regarding this risk of nuclear proliferation. And coming back to some of the words said by the other speakers, this issue of enrichment of uranium has reached a symbolic level, which is now very related to sovereignty. And of course, Iran has been the first to use this as a tool to demonstrate its capacity or put pressure on the others. But in the region, apart from the UAE, which of course has accepted the American gold standards of no enrichment, there is this tendency I've heard in meetings even in Jordan, which is not considered, of course, a major threat in the region, but they have this idea that having the capacity to enrich uranium now is part of sovereignty. It shouldn't be deprived of them, and they don't want to have any constraints on this capacity. So this is where we have to decouple the issue of energy, which of course is also related to the climate crisis, the reduction of fossil fuels, and this risk of nuclear proliferation. And this is where the JCPOA, despite all its weaknesses, can appear as a sort of new norm, which could be accepted internationally.
Thank you. Dr. Cornelis, we have 2 minutes left for
Thank you. I will try only to use one. When you asked your last question to the general, you omitted one of the models that exist. You asked them whether Iran wanted to follow the Pakistani, the Indian, or the North Korean model, but there is, of course, also the Israeli model. I don't think this is something that
they don't admit they have a model.
That's a model. That's a model not to admit. So speaking of threshold state and etc., that is a model. Of course, it's not a model that Iran can follow because Iran is a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and India never was, Israel never was, Pakistan never was, and so there is only North Korea the way that it could technically follow, but it may not. And in order to prevent this from happening, I think the international effort that we talked about is very well justified. There is also a difference between this non-proliferation level, where we do have a regime, the NPT, we have the powers of the UN Security Council, and on the other hand, all those regional security questions, the militias, the missiles, etc. This is not the same level of international legal involvement. Let me put it this way. There was a reason why the UN Security Council, after the IAEA in Vienna put the issue to New York, why the UN Security Council got involved on Iran's program and came up with the JCPOA, or endorsed the JCPOA once it was negotiated. So that's a level at which we have to work. The next level would be regional security. There are initiatives from the countries in the region, and it ultimately, despite what you rightly said about guarantors, it has to come from the countries in the region. You can't have regional security if the countries themselves don't want to sit around the table. They can't be forced to sit at the table. And then at a third level, I would see all these smaller initiatives, maritime security, environmental affairs, issues which can be taken up any day, as long as, not member states, I'm too European, as long as states in the region agree on this. So this is the menu from which to choose, and I do hope that countries will make their pick. Thank you very much.
Why not to go both on parallel, both tracks? Okay, you can have that a nuclear track, and you can have that regional issues with, of course, regional security, with regional cooperation. And another track, when I said the guarantor, what I meant that if we sit on the table, should be that guarantor, same like the 2015 deal with the snapshot. That was, I mean, with the 7th chapter of UN 7th. You need that kind of, that it is can guarantee that something can be fulfilled from all parties. With this, I would really thank you so much, General Udi, Mark, and Dr. Cornelis, for your really, I enjoyed this, it was rich, and we really debated each other. And I think our followers enjoyed that. Thank you very much. And for our followers and viewers, we have the third panel. After half an hour, you can use the link and register again in 45 minutes and join us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.